welcome to the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. My name is Uriah, aka the inverted form.
And my name is Owen, aka Gil. Fuck. All right, cut. Start over. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Owen Gilbride. Welcome to Footnotes for Endnotes.
So it's been a pretty exciting week. How has lockdown been in Montreal? How's your life been this week?
The quarantine is still ongoing. The curfew, the 8 p.m. curfew, which I spoke of at length, is still present with us. Supposedly, like the first or second week of February, they're gonna be like reviewing it, but like they basically do that at the start of every month. So like, my hopes aren't super up, but we shall see. It's gotten really cold. It's like minus 20 degrees outside. Everything's frozen. But you know what? That's okay because there's lots of exciting things on the internet. The internet is the star of life this week for everybody.
Sure is. I mean, it's been the star of the last year. But a lot of exciting things on the internet to take our mind off the frozen, empty, dark worlds outside where we're not even allowed to go, really.
For those of you who are listening to this podcast sometime in the future, assuming society hasn't collapsed in the year 2021, we are, of course, talking about the still ongoing, I don't know if there's a fun name for it, but the Game Stonks event that is taking place. Yeah, basically we're doing what they did in the 1920s, but we're doing it intentionally for fun.
Pretty interesting stuff. You know, the Wall Street Bets subreddit went down briefly. I was looking at it on, I think, like Tuesday or Wednesday or something. And then it went down briefly because, you know, they got banned from Discord because of, quote, hate speech, end quote. I mean, we all know what that is. And they shut down the Wall Street Bets subreddit briefly. They didn't shut it down, but they made it private for a brief period of time because there's so much influx and so much attention being paid to it that the moderators are saying that they wanted to automate the moderation protocol because they weren't able to do it manually, and they didn't want to get banned, so they made it private for a brief period of time, and then I guess they figured it out, so it's back up again, so we can all still go there and see what the next meme stock is for the next week. I mean, apparently the wind is going out of the sails of the meme stock meme or moment. I guess GME has I think it's probably like on Monday is going to be like the decisive moment because like the markets are closed over the weekend. But my understanding, which is very tendential, I mean, really don't take my word for this, is I've like basically gained all of my knowledge of the stock market over the past week. Like the reason it was up really high at the beginning of the week, which like brought all the attention to it, which I'm talking about GameStop specifically, and then the hedge funds like kind of like pulled out, or they short sold, or they sold short all of their stocks in order to bring it down, in order to kind of like put the fear into the memers. But like on Twitter, all these like hold the line hashtags have been trending and whatnot. Like the general attitude has been that this is the hedge funds trying to intimidate the like small investor. So I think on Monday maybe like I expect it to kind of go back up or something. I don't really know.
That's been what my interest has been in this. Like now, obviously that this has become such a huge meme. Like, you know, if there's just like everybody's talking about it, there's a lot of people who are gonna like try to be getting on board in order to make money. And like hot tip, like if you're someone who's not an active stock market person and like you're hearing about a stock market meme, it's probably too late in terms of making a profit. like once normal people are talking about it, it's like a no-go. But what I find interesting is that like the actual like original, like the Wall Street bets, like internet troll trader types who got this ball rolling, like I don't interact with these people too personally, but like just based on the kinds of memes that are trending, it seems that they are like, or maybe I'm just wanting to believe that they're more motivated by like fucking with hedge funds than by like trying to get rich. That seems to be their main motivation here.
I think a lot of people are definitely motivated by that, and they really want to. They're really like getting pleasure out of the idea of taking down the Wall Street billionaires. It's Occupy Wall Street all over again, except it has moved to the digital space, which is really where it should have been to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, if it were to be a real occupation of Wall Street, but yeah, as I was saying off mic, I think it's a bit overstated how much damage is, or how much of an effect this is having on the hedge funds, because there are multiple trillions of dollars that are moving through the New York Stock Exchange every day, and the loss of a few $billion, which is potentially recoverable, is not, I think, in like that big of a deal for them. Like it's something that they can kind of write off. It's something that they can cope with. Even, I mean, I'm sure that it hurts like individual stockholders or whatever, but it's certainly not like bringing Wall Street to its knees, which I think some of the kind of hyperbolic left, like are like sympathetic left coverage of this whole phenomenon has kind of been saying.
Yeah, it's like definitely this one event. I don't think it's gonna like necessarily be like the massive game changer that some people are describing it as, but I do think that this is like a good example of something that I've been like thinking about and talking about for a while that excites me as like a potentiality for the future. Is like in my opinion, I think like the development of like a modern, like truly like populist, like class consciousness amongst like the masses is going to somehow make use of like the internet and meme culture. So I think like each event like this in which like there's this sort of like mimetic emergence of something that actually has like real world ramifications, like even the Capitol Hill protest earlier this year, which I don't necessarily endorse. Like I don't endorse the people that did that, but like I find it interesting that something that started sort of as like almost a joke is kind of like, this like goofy thing actually had like such massive real world ramifications. Mimetic class consciousness, something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to, I mean, I'm a bit like agnostic about like this idea of mimetic class consciousness. I mean, I want to think that is true, that the internet is going to be like some important catalyst for like social movements in the future. I mean, and it's going to be true at least in like an instrumental sense. Like obviously communication on the internet is very important for widespread social movements, but in terms of like this mimetic class consciousness, like I'm still a bit agnostic. I just haven't like thought too much about it or like read too much about it to really like be unequivocally saying that I think that is how it's going to happen. Like I think that real world organizing and that sort of thing is still important, perhaps the decisive factor. But I mean that kind of makes me think of like the other side of the left take on the Wall Street bets, the game stonks phenomenon. We have the one kind of leftist take saying that hyperbolic take saying that this is going to bring Wall Street to its knees. This is like a financial revolution, and et cetera, et cetera. But then we have the other type of people. This is like perhaps something that has been more, I've seen a lot more on my timeline personally. Like I feel like I've had to seek out the first example, But more prevalent on my timeline in particular is the kind of leftist who is just raining on everybody's parade and talking about how like focusing in on the culture of the Wall Street Bets community. It's a bunch of like 4chan is a bunch of frog posters. It's a bunch of like white supremacists, racists who use all kinds of like ableist and like generally problematic language, and they bully people into spending their life savings on the stock market. And if you only go in for like a little bit, if you don't put everything on the line, then you're this or that. And it's like this kind of like left take, like focusing in on, I think, the completely like superficial aspect of the phenomenon, and like same of the Capitol Hill riots, same even of the Donald Trump election and that whole phenomenon, as well as like the gang. Like, I think that it is completely disingenuous. It is shallow thinking. It is focusing in on simply the wrong phenomenon to look at these mass movements that are spread through a particular form of culture and focus in on the problematic aspects of that culture, and thereby condemn what is really a novel form of organizing that we should all be thinking about, like in the thinking like sympathetically about the idea of mimetic class consciousness, or like spreading class consciousness through memes. We have, as leftists, as socialists, we have something to learn from the historical examples of that working, even if it comes from people who we find culturally repugnant, like the Donald Trump supporters who memed him into the office, the Capitol Hill protesters who are like the QAnon people who memed themselves into a fucking insurrection. And now these like these 4chan style like day traders who meme themselves into millions of dollars. It's absurd to focus on like the kinds of language that they use and to like not see what is actually happening.
Yeah, this is something that I brought up a lot because I do feel like, like these are all obviously, the concerns that the left typically has with like people on the right. Like they're all valid concerns, but I think like if your interest is genuinely like, bringing on some sort of revolutionary movement or changing the social structure, you need to be like, you need to prioritize somewhat. You need to be like kind of a utilitarian. Like, I mean, obviously you don't want to like, you don't want to like join forces with like actual like racists who are going around committing like actual hate crimes. But if there's like someone on the internet that's doing something and it's effective and it's actually challenging power in a meaningful way, or like, like getting energy mobilized and it's working and it could be used for like all sorts of different purposes, don't disregard that just because like, he's saying some silly shit on the internet just to get a rise out of you. Because like, I don't want to be conspiracy theorist, but like I would have to imagine that the people in power would just be completely pleased if everyone on the left was just in this position of like tone policing other working class people who basically have no power, and just endlessly getting into like these debates about like what the right and wrong way to address each other is without actually doing anything meaningful in terms of like coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's really important to look at any example of like internet activity that gets energies mobilized in the real world. Like in all of these cases, like internet activity has managed to effectively mobilize people into real world offline movements that are able to challenge power. Like in the case of the stock market, I mean, it's still kind of like virtual in a sense, but it is still like it is no longer at the realm of discourse. Like it's to some extent material. Like the stock market is like really weird phenomenon. It's like very virtual, and it's very like difficult to, see how it is material. It's all like abstract value. It's like very immaterial in a sense, but it is still, dollars and cents. It's still, people making money. Yeah, that's it. But yeah, I think that, just to be unequivocally clear about something, I mean, I think that it is bad to use oppressive language. I mean, I don't endorse that. I don't condone it, whatever. And I don't think that is really something that we should like forgive in people that we are, engaging with. I think that, especially as like people who are not part of the this is like such a old truism, like everybody knows this, but as like people who are not part of the category that is being, victimized or like that is subject to like the problematic language in use, you know what I mean? Like as, straight white men, we are especially responsible for calling out problematic language or language that, is oppressive towards people who are not straight white men. It's like our responsibility to do that, blah, blah, blah. That is all true, but it's just such a fucking like waste of time to like, it's just such an excuse, like a way to get yourself out of doing the work of like separating the culture that we don't like from the, real material practice that we do like, by like focusing in on that culture.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, and this is addressed to, people who are basically in our position, like straight white men who are like amicable to like the ethical positions of the left, generally speaking, who are probably the ones that are in the best position to be having these sorts of conversations. Again, like, I think it's important to be kind of like pragmatic and have like a utilitarian mindset, and like ask yourself what you're really trying to achieve. Like on the one hand, like as I was saying before, if you actually want to achieve revolution, you got to look at like what's working effectively, no matter the source it's coming from. You need to at least like consider it. On the other hand, if you are trying to like change the way that people think and act and talk to each other, like change the kind of language they use, like what's the best way to actually facilitate those conversations? Like I think if anything, the last decade has taught us that just like demonizing people and canceling them and trying to bar them from platforms and conversations is not actually like a good way to like change public perception. If anything, you're just going to get like Jordan Peterson style pushback, like, oh, look at you shrill leftists who are like complaining all the time. If you have the emotional capacity to actually engage in conversation, there's like so many better ways you could do that. Like I know in my own experience talking to people with right-wing views, like you need to actually approach them as like a human being and recognize that they're probably coming from the position that they are because of something to do with their upbringing and like very real concerns they have about life and things they don't understand. They're not doing it because they're some sort of villain who was born bad and just has like this evil, like supremacist view of the world. Like they've kind of fallen into these positions over a long period of time. That might be very intelligent, emotional people with like a complex personality that you could probably learn things from yourself. So like, if you are someone like myself, like a white cis male who's not being personally affected by most of these like, negative terms that are being used, and you have the opportunity to approach these people for, some sort of dialogue, I would recommend not just like getting angry at them, not just trying to cancel them, because that doesn't work. It's like, that's just you acting on your emotions. Like that's just satisfying your own momentary impulse to feel self-righteous. It's not actually like improving society in the long term. It's just going to create further polarization.
Yeah, totally. It's pretty funny that we're talking about this, or like that you say that, and that I, said what I said, because like my personal strategy on the internet, my approach to engaging with people of all sorts is that like I don't really have the capacity to talk to right-wing people. If it's like about something neutral, like if we're having a conversation that is ongoing, that's fine, like whatever. But I don't really have the interest or like the motivation to like try to like change people's minds or to, I don't know, lecture people, or even like with fellow leftists, fellow travelers at least, if they are like I put out a lot of content on the internet and I get a lot of like frankly low level people engaging with it, and I don't really have the time or capacity to try to like bring them up to my level. I know this sounds extremely arrogant and pretentious, but I am not really interested in I don't know, like spending that much energy on strangers. Like perhaps if we had a relationship or something, I would try to do that more, try to engage with you more. But I don't know, personally, my personal approach is to just not engage with things as soon as a conversation online, especially, starts going in a direction where like I feel like the point is being completely missed, or like the person is like just completely in another realm or something. Like I kind of will just stop engaging with them because like I don't have the fucking time or energy to like start from square one, you know what I mean? Like I'm more interested in talking to people who are like somewhat on my level and having conversations that are able to that we're like actually like talking about the same thing, you know what I mean? Like
no, I mean I totally recognize that like everything I just described, that's like, you know, like different people have different ways of like being in the world. And like my personal mode of being is I've always been like quite, at least I think I'm pretty good at like getting into other people's headspaces, and like kind of, I find I get a lot of value even from like, as you know, I read a lot of books that don't necessarily agree with my politics, or like I'll talk to people that I don't necessarily agree with, and I find that I still get value from like trying to understand their headspace. But like basically I think that like in any group of people who might be like politically aligned or like studying a certain area of material, you're going to have like different personalities. So some people are going to be more inclined to want to reach out to like the other and try to like, you know, forge some sort of like conversation, extend the olive branch. But then I think there's also a lot of value in being kind of like more focused on a particular thing, being a little more uncompromising, and like, you know, really like keeping the core strong, because there is like a downside certainly to being too compromising. Like you don't want to get like, you don't want to lose sight of your movement. So I think like in any successful group dynamic, and I imagine like in any successful revolutionary movement of the past, even if there was like this one like leader that emerged, like if you actually look behind the scenes, there was probably all sorts of different like high agency people who had their own role to play.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's never really one leader. There's just like a figurehead, and then there are a bunch of people who are, you know, generally writing. It's the people who write things down that are remembered by history. I guess we can kind of transition into the essay at this point.
Finishing off the long ass essay we've been doing for 3 episodes now.
Yeah, finishing off A History of Separation, history of the workers' movement from 1885, I believe, 1883 to 1980, 1883 to 1982.
Second Industrial Revolution up until like stagflation, basically.
Yeah, up until the communization turn. Honestly, I have not been entirely impressed by this essay. I think the afterward section is probably the best section for me. Maybe parts of defeat as well, because it gets like a bit more abstract. It gets a bit more like theoretical and more like engaged in contemporary literature. But for the rest of it, I feel like it's just kind of like reiterating things that they've already said. But like, I guess this is something that I think we have both like expressed throughout reading Endnotes, is that a lot of the stuff that they have said, or a lot of the essays that they've written, have really been just about like putting things on record and like just making things really clear and explicit, even when it's like kind of obvious and we already know about it to some extent. They're just really like laying out their program, even when it involves like repeating things that they've already said. So I found a lot of this essay to be a bit repetitive, even as it is like more explicitly laying out, a history of the workers' movement. Like it's still like using a lot of concepts and ideas that we have already seen in Endnotes previously.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's well enough written, but I get the feeling that it was kind of almost written and for people who had not read the first three volumes of Endnotes.
Absolutely.
Because it like draws from a lot. Like I'm specifically thinking of like the misery and debt essay, like basically all of the essays where they've talked about the surplus population, the essay about like the housing question from volume 2, I believe.
Yeah.
Like, so as we've read all of these, like you said, like there's a bit of interesting stuff towards the end of this, but for the most part, it's kind of just like a consolidation of like all of these other points that they've established. So like, if you've been following along with us, like, it's not a bad essay. It's like, it's a good piece of writing, but like, don't necessarily expect to like get anything that you haven't if you've like read up till here in the Endnotes corpus.
Yeah, that's true. I kind of like wonder about that, and like wonder about the strategy or like their approach to Endnotes so far, to the whole publishing series, because like my initial impression from going from volume 2 to volume 3 is that they're really building off of each other, and that volume 2 was also about laying down a lot of their framework, about like making their kind of like program explicit, and it really had the sense that they were doing like preliminary work before they developed off of it. They were doing a lot of like Marxological like scholarship. It really felt like scholarship. It felt like synthesis of things that are out there, and it's a journal called Endnotes. It felt like they were like putting a lot of citations together and kind of like constructing a narrative, or like at least like the foundation for a narrative that they would be developing. And then Endnotes 3 is definitely my favorite of the ones that we have read so far. It felt like there was some real like innovative work in there, some real there's a lot of like interesting stuff, like the essay on gender, the essay on logistics, and the essay on race were all real standouts. Even the final essay, spontaneity, mediation, and rupture, these are all standout essays that really felt like they were developing off of what they had already laid down in Endnotes 2. It felt like they were, doing something more original and creative, and not kind of like repeating themselves. But Endnotes 4 so far has felt a bit repetitive, and I wonder like why they felt the need to do that. Like, why did they? I mean, I guess like it is kind of like the difference between a book series and a periodical, like a magazine or a journal. In a journal, you don't really assume that everyone has read the previous issues, and you kind of are expected to repeat yourself and kind of like continually be refining and repeating your position, so that people who are coming in kind of late in the game are able to follow along. But where like my initial impression was that it would be more in the line of like a book series, where each one would be developing, and they would not be repeating themselves, but they'd be referring back to themselves, which they do a lot of, and they even refer forward. So it's strange, because they refer in Endnotes. I feel like in Endnotes 2 they're referring to Endnotes 4. Endnotes 3 and 4 they've been referring to Endnotes 5. So they definitely have this like mapped out vision of what they're publishing and what they're thinking, but they're also like repeating themselves. I don't know. I guess it's just in the interest of like continually making themselves clear, and like just continually like laying down the foundation of what it is that they think and like refining their perspective. And yeah, I mean, it is, again, the journal is called Endnotes. It's really about like scholarship, even though it's like kind of radical and trying to like break new grounds and develop this kind of this theoretical tendency that is itself like innovative and new and like kind of it's not really entrenched in a way. It's like new and young, whatever. So they're developing within this kind of like heterodox kind of theoretical tendency, but it is called Endnotes. It's a scholarly journal where they're systematizing and putting together things that already exist. Their writing is based on old writing, so it's not like they're doing like new theoretical innovations. It's more like they are synthesizing and systematizing.
As you're describing all of that, I'm having a realization that like perhaps in a lot of ways Endnotes, what they're doing is kind of like an inversion of what we were talking about at the start of this podcast, like this sort of new mimetic activism you're seeing where like on the one hand, like all of the stuff going on in the internet, it like speaks to like a new field, like things that would not have been possible in any previous era, like all of these like new tactics that nobody really knows what they're going to amount to in the long term. Like nobody even knows like the proper way to go about doing it, like how to like integrate these into like some sort of more formalized theory. It's just like very like free flowing and energetic and experimental and may or may not have like meaningful results. Whereas like what Endnote seems to be doing is like this very slow, methodical, where they're being very careful not to like suggest like, oh, just do this, because they recognize that it's like a very complex, like long running like situation that we're in. Like the development of capitalism goes all the way back to like the 1100s or something. You can see like the seeds of it. So it's this like very long historical process. They're like drawing from all sorts of like sometimes very obscure literature and trying to like build this like complex, at times systematic understanding of the situation. And it requires like a lot of focus, and at times it can feel really repetitive. So that is interesting to me. I don't think either approach is like de facto the right one. I think they both have their merits.
Yeah, I guess like really everything that we've been saying, like, I mean, in a way it is a criticism. Everything that I've been saying, I guess, in a way it is a criticism. It certainly sounds like I am criticizing Endnotes, but at the same time, like, we should acknowledge that, like, they are not making a lot of like big claims for their project. Like, it really is a kind of niche thing. It's like a very particular it's a very particular and like specific thing that they're doing. They're just, reading a lot of communist literature and theory and, putting it together and like doing the labor of reading all this like diverse stuff and then presenting it to people who are interested, who are involved in this general sphere. Like, it's a very specific thing. It's a research journal, really, and it's kind of unfair to put this expectation on them of like doing all this kind of like, or like making all these, or making any kind of like novel claims and like actually contributing to the theory itself. It's really, I mean, again, it's called Endnotes. Like, it's in the title. It's their whole like branding and their whole approach. Like, what they're doing is based around reading stuff, and like all the stuff that they cite is like pretty old, generally speaking. Like, in this essay, like some of the most recent things are from like the early 2000s, but there's a lot of stuff from like the 80s, the 70s, and older. So it's really just about a bunch of nerds like going through the archive of like communist theory and trying to like trace a narrative. I mean, they do have this like perspective. They do have a standpoint, so they are putting these things together towards like a certain end to like support a particular narrative. But yeah, I mean, again, like what we should just appreciate that what they're doing is actually limited. They've like set limits on what they're doing, so it's kind of unfair to criticize them for not going beyond those limits, you know. So what can we actually say about the essay itself? So we've got the fracturing of the workers' movement, which is basically just about how, like after the war, I guess. No, we already read fracturing. Sorry.
No, I think we started at Strange Victory.
Right.
Where they talk about basically like, this is the one that most heavily draws from the like notes on the new housing question essay, where they talk about the 1950s, how like due to like the post-war circumstances in North America, it actually seemed like capitalism was working pretty well. Like people had their houses in the suburbs. They had all sorts of new forms of entertainment and washing machines and blah, blah, blah. And how this, even though it was like, you know, temporary, obviously, at the time, certainly diminished the revolutionary force of the workers' movement.
Yeah.
They're less inclined to want to like take to the streets when like their lives are going pretty well.
Right. This is around the point in history. It's like after the Second World War, when you know, the workers' movement actually participated heavily in the war efforts, you know, in the form of Russian communists and I guess just like workers' movement or social democratic parties throughout the Western nations, like really participated in that. And then they found themselves, you know, in the position of like having a victory, I guess, but not having actually won anything. So I think one of the most interesting dynamics that they kind of develop in these last sections is about how, you know, the early communist revolutionaries, like going back to like the origin of, you know, the Socialist Democratic Party in Russia and Germany, like Kautsky and Bernstein and Trotsky and Lenin and all these guys, were talking about how they wanted to basically like make all of the world like a factory and an office, and like the earliest visions of socialism were like a complete proletarianization of the population, of the world population, turning everybody into a proletariat, turning everybody into a factory worker. And basically like the kind of thesis, or like one of the, for me, central thesis is CSI coming out of this entire essay is that, you know, the early socialists wanted to accomplish this, turn everybody into a factory worker or into an office worker. And then that kind of is what happened, but it also happened alongside this atomization. So now we have this situation where everybody is a worker, but nobody is connected. Like at the same time, the working class identity has been completely eradicated. So we have like the worst of every possible world.
Yeah, that was something in this essay that I think, because like something that Endnotes has been saying like since we started reading them is like they really want to like emphasize the fact that like the particularities of the present situation are like much different than in the early days of the workers' movement. And I felt like, you know, that what you just said was like extremely illustrative of that, like about how the early workers' movement had this like utopian vision of like everyone being a factory worker, because at that time there seemed to be something like, you know, aspirational and like enjoyable and like sensible about being a factory worker. Whereas like now at the end of the 20th century and in the 21st century, when you hear like factory worker, we just think of these really menial, like automated, robotic, dehumanizing jobs that most people probably couldn't even get because they've all been actually automated and done by robots. Factories are just destroying the environment. There's nothing like aspirational about like the idea of like everyone working in a factory. Like nowadays, if you said, oh, I have this vision where everyone's going to be a factory worker, that sounds like a nightmare scenario. Nobody wants that.
Because, honestly, it sounds, in a way, it sounds like a good scenario because, like, factory work is like one of the oldest works and types of job, and like at least in the West, it is now like what we call the labor aristocracy. Working in a factory or working in manufacturing is one of the best types of jobs that you can get because they're all so heavily unionized, as well as like working in trades. They're some of the best jobs you can get because they have such a long history of being like organized, and they have been for over a century, the principal focus of the workers' movement. So they are all unionized. They all have really good pay. They all have like, breaks and like good or decent working conditions. Like working in a factory is actually one of the better jobs that you could possibly hope for, but they're so rare because everything has been automated.
Yeah, I should specify, like, if there was like plentiful factory jobs, like in the style of like Lenin's day, like if everyone could just be like carpenter or welder, like, there was all these options and they were all like this skill you could develop and like something that you could be kind of proud of and like you'd be able to do it your whole life, like that might be all right. But, the reality is like when you try to envision like, okay, what would a mass factory work environment be like now? It'd be like all of these redundant jobs where you're just like worker number 4,276 pressing the button so that the robotic arm like screws the back cover onto the iPad, and you're just doing that for like 10 hours a day, or you're like driving the mechanical cart around in the Amazon warehouse putting books into envelopes.
Yeah, totally. And I guess on the topic of working in factories, something that I thought was pretty interesting is how they refer to like Spanish anarchism, which is like kind of in the first decades of the 20th century, I guess, like the big anarchist revolution or whatever happened in like the 30s, I think, in Spain.
Yeah, somewhere around.
So they kind of like talk about how the workers' movements kind of like took advantage or like utilized like the kind of like old artisanal like workers' identification with their job and like their pride. Like artisan workers, were really able to identify with their job and take pride in it because they were doing something like from beginning to end, like making this commodity, and it was all on them, and the commodity like reflected like their skill level. It's like very like obvious how it's very different from the kind of work that we think of nowadays, because like artisanal work, like it's it can be like a real source of pride. So the Spanish anarchists kind of like took advantage of all of the artisanal workers, which I guess was a lot more widespread in Spain at the time than like proletarian style work. But they took advantage of that in order to like build class consciousness and to, like get all of these artisanal workers to be proletarianized. And then once that happened, then that like initial drive, that identification with the work that allowed them to like do a kind of like a social democratic kind of like revolution, like a kind of proletarian revolution, a workers' movement, disappeared because nobody had any identification with their job anymore. Everybody found themselves working in a factory, like putting the head on a pin or something, like doing some completely alienated form of labor that, obviously there's no pride in there because like you're just one aspect, one like link in the chain, and you never get to see like the commodity that you're building. You're really just doing like one tiny part of it. And I guess they kind of like bring in Gramsci and the whole idea of Fordism and how that has been kind of extended over the entire world, and how like everything is now Fordist in the sense of like as you said, like your job at the factory is to do this one tiny aspect of the entire labor process, and you never get to see the final commodity except perhaps at a store, but you never get to like see the thing that you built because you didn't really build anything. You just like screwed the back plate onto the iPad or whatever. And yeah, I guess this is kind of this will kind of segue us into talking about service work, but they kind of like talk about how this Fordist style of production kind of like extended over the entire world, and there's also like how we see like real subsumption occurring in the world. Real subsumption being like the actual transformation of the labor process by capital. So as this style of producing things where you divide the labor up rather than have like one person do the entire labor process, you divide it up. It's more efficient that way. To have like 1,000 people building one iPad, each one doing like one thing, it's way more efficient. So that style of production like extends everywhere, and it changes like the actual way that people produce. First, you get the artisans to like have to sell their like fancy iPad, their handmade, handcrafted iPad on the market. That is how you like formally subsume them to capital, because like they become dependent on the marketplace. But they're still doing labor in their old style. But as soon as you get them hooked on the drug of commodity exchange or whatever, of value, then eventually it's only a matter of time before competition between themselves and other people forces them basically to need to make their whole labor process more efficient, and eventually that evolves into Fordism. But one thing that we have seen is that there's certain labor activities that don't really lend themselves to being like proletarianized, or like that don't really lend themselves to real subsumption in the same kind of way. And this is what we call the service economy. These are the jobs that are kind of left behind, that can't really be turned into a good. This is another thing that they said that was actually pretty interesting to me, is that basically real subsumption is essentially like turning a labor activity, a labor process, into a good. So like a house cleaner or whatever becomes like a dishwasher and a vacuum cleaner. Then you can, instead of like having a person doing the work, then you can just sell the person who pays for the work a commodity, and then that's more efficient and it's more beneficial to capital. But certain tasks, like for example caring for the elderly or caring for children, that can't really be reduced to a commodity. You can't really have a robot take care of children, even though I'm sure
they would do it if they could.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people working on it right now, actively like working on that.
Like your AI call center worker, that's just going to be coming up soon.
Yeah, I mean, all you have to do is make a cyborg that is like really like good at replicating a human being, and then the kids won't be able to tell the difference. And then yeah, you just sell cyborgs.
Kids raised by walking iPads. World of tomorrow. Our post-labor utopia that we were all promised.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, I guess it's interesting to think about the service economy in this way, as like what is the kind of like type of activity, laborious activity that is left over by real subsumption, that can't really be subsumed or like transformed or like turned into a good, which is like basically that remains the only real type of labor that is left to the surplus population. Like the primary type of work that surplus populations are allowed to do is service work, like working at Walmart, working in a kitchen, or like, working at a nursing center or something like that, something that you need somebody to actually do.
But as you're saying all of this, something that I've been thinking about, like if there is like a theme, like a distinct theme that I felt with this essay that wasn't, just like an encapsulation of stuff from other essays, like I felt this recurring sense in the analysis of the workers' movement of the like 19th and 20th century, what you could call like deals with the devil that were basically made with like the hopes of like long-term benefit. Like on the one hand, you have like, the workers' parties as they get more and more embedded into the existing power structure. In the short term, it seems like a way to get some leverage in order to bring about the revolution. But then once they're actually in there, they start to lose their revolutionary interest because they've got too many connections. They're playing by the rules. So that's the deal with the devil on like, the molar side. Maybe on the more molecular side. Sorry, I'm using Gaussian again. Like you have this technological innovation, and in a way it's like very similar to what you see in capitalist technological development, is this idea that like if we keep developing technology, it's going to like free us up to just like enjoy like hedonistic excess, or like be artists, or like be scholars or whatever. Like this has always been the promise, the whole like since technological development exploded in whatever century. Like there's always been this like idea that if we just like hustle really hard and give up like the things that kind of like feel like they define us now, we're going to have like this perfect like utopian world where everyone can just chill and do whatever they want. Like this is a promise that exists in liberalism, capitalism, and to a certain extent in the workers' movement. Like in this essay, they're describing things like how they convinced the artisans to give up like, work that they would take pride in because it was like more efficient for everyone to just be like a small cog in a big machine. And they said like, okay, if we just do this, we'll have like the perfect factory system. And then like, we'll be beyond it eventually. We'll just have machines doing it. If you look at like what actually happened, no, we're all still working, but we're working these increasingly like menial jobs. Right. And which like, with all that being said, it does make me wonder if there's some other factor at play here that has to do with like the technological mindset itself, that like the workers' movement, if it is to actually succeed in its vision, needs to disentangle itself from to a certain degree. Because like clearly what's like made evident here is that like the utopian vision of the 19th century of just like the world factory didn't actually pan out the way it was supposed to.
No, I mean it did in a way, but like it was stupid and it sucks now. Like it did pan out. Like they managed to succeed in getting everybody to be a proletarian, but now we're all stuck in this shitty situation of working completely alienating jobs that we have no identification with. And also now, because everybody's a worker, everybody is like, they have this concept of unity and separation. We're all, atoms within capitalism. We're all separated from each other, even though like we all share this identity of being a worker. So we're unified in that sense, but that unification is simple, or it's not sufficient for anything because we're all separated by the social relations of capitalism. So we have the unity, but like that unity entails separation. So even though we managed to accomplish this dream of the early socialists of like extending the factory to basically every like form of life, every place in the world, it sucks.
Yeah, which like makes me really like skeptical of like any sort of like, as much as on the one hand I want to believe, like I look at this and then I look at like any sort of utopian promise today, like, oh, we're going to go to space, we're going to like develop even more technology. And then
exactly.
We're like,
still
this
chasing
promise
the same
has been made
dream
so many times and it's bullshit every time.
I know.
So like to tie this back to current events though, like it does make me at least like emotionally sympathize with like this like stock market event, because it seems to be coming from this place of like, like fuck strategy, fuck having a vision. We're just going to get extremely chaotic and kind of like lash out at like power and see what that does, like just see where the pieces fall. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing. Like that's probably like, you know, how civilizations collapse, but like I kind of get it.
All right, so before we wrap up, there's just one final part that I think it was relating to what we were just talking about, the question of like technology and how, you know, society has developed of late. Like towards the end of this section, they talk about how, like, we should clarify that, like, as they clarify, you know, this early conception of the workers' movement of like turning everything into a factory and like developing technology and like making everybody a worker, that is not what Marx thought at any point in his writing. That is a non-Marxist thought, or is a misinterpretation of Marx. It's basically, it's not what Marx thought. Marx thought the opposite. And at some point in this essay, they quote how Marx was like very like supportive of the Russian communes, and he kind of like looked to that form of social organization as a potential like form for the future. Like he thought, he was optimistic about the Russian communes, like these kind of rural commune societies that existed in Russia, as like a potential model for how, you know, a future, you know, utopian society would look. Like he did not at any fucking point talk about how, you know, everybody should be a proletarian. Like he was obviously, explicitly, famously about abolishing all classes. And, you know, the early workers movement, to their credit, they like also were about that. They quote this one manifesto talking about how they wanted to abolish all classes. And that is, you know, so that was part of the discourse, even at the earliest stages of the workers movement. And people who, you know, wanted to make all of the world a factory, I believe Endnotes said that like they still believe that to be like in transition, and people like Lenin and Trotsky still thought that you had to like move through that in order to get to a place of being able to abolish capitalism or something. Like they didn't really think that that was like the end stage or something. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to refer to this idea in Marx of like you know, the rural commune as like, you know, an important social model that we can look to for how, you know, the future should look. And just at this point, you know, this is something that I completely that I consistently bring up in this podcast, is how nobody fucking thinks about China. Nobody remembers the Great Leap campaign in China when they, you know, the communists turned everything. They developed these rural communes. Like that was part of their program of moving in the second 5-year plan, which was, you know, nicknamed the Great Leap. They decided that they were done being socialists and they were going to become communists. And the way they would do that is by communizing the peasantry. And, you know, what had previously been collective farming, they had already done land redistribution, they had done land reform, got rid of the landowners, the landlords, and everything was collectively farmed. They would turn it into communes, which is like, I guess, just a more radical. They don't really want to get too deep into these kinds of terms or whatever, but like the idea of a commune is just like more radical form of a collective or whatever. I guess everybody's like sharing in the profits, sharing in the labor more equally than a collective. Anyway, so they did that. They turned everything into communes, all these collectives into communes. So all the countryside is composed of a bunch of communes, and they also like spread out. They developed like light and medium like productive factories, and they kind of like spread those out through the countryside. So the heavy industry was concentrated in the urban centers, and previously all kinds of industry were concentrated in the cities. But then in this campaign, they like spread out like the production of fertilizer and other kinds of like, I don't know what you would call light and medium industry, but these kinds of commodities that could be produced in the countryside, they would like build like these kind of like small kind of rural factories in order to like be able to produce things more locally, so that you don't have to like go to the city in order to get your fertilizer or something, but you could like produce the fertilizer closer to where it is being used, which is totally like thinking back to the logistics essay from Endnotes 3. It's totally in line with that. Thinking back to my interview with Jasper Burns, like this is they fucking did it. They did the whole communization vision. I mean, it was brief and it didn't last forever. And there are other problems in communist China, but it's just so weird to me that like even as they referred like very barely to China in this essay, they're simply like not on anybody's radar. Like nobody's thinking about China. It's really continually frustrating to me.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, as someone who doesn't know too much about like the 20th century history of China, and who doesn't really trust much of what I hear about 21st century China one way or the other, because I'm sure both China and not China are giving me propaganda. I feel like what happened to China over the course of the 20th century is something unprecedented, to say the least.
Absolutely.
And like the rest of the world, I'm not saying I necessarily want the whole world to be like China, but like I feel like it definitely bears much closer examination what actually happened there. Like, what were they doing?
It has its own communist history. Like Maoism is an important theoretical tendency, and I just feel like it should be better represented. Like Endnotes, especially of all people, should be doing more work in looking to China, in reading what theory there is, going through the archives, reading like Charles Bettelheim and whatnot. There's like much less theory on China than there is on Russia, so it's like scanter, but it's there. There's stuff there, and I just wish that more people were less Eurocentric and less Sinophobic.
Yeah.
Anyway,
for sure.
That's all I have to say. Maybe we should finish up here unless there's anything else that you want to add on.
I think that just about covers it. So for the listeners at home, if you haven't read too much Endnotes, this essay is a pretty good place to start. If you have read a decent amount of Endnotes, you might find it kind of repetitive. Overall, not a bad essay. I'll give it three red stars out of 5.
Yeah, I think that's a fair rating. I'll give it 3 black and red flags out of 5. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. If you want more content, if you want to talk to us more, then you can go support us on Patreon and get access to our Discord, patreon.com/theinvertedform. Also follow me on Twitter.
GameStonk money.
Yeah, send some of your GameStonk money. I'm sure a lot of you are investing out there.
Yeah,
so
all you nerds out there.
This is basically a form of stock. You're investing in us, and at some point we will lead a communist revolution, and that is how your investment will pay off.
We'll remember the early investors later on.
Exactly. So we have a Discord. You can pay to get access, or you can just send me a DM if you're interested in talking with us. If you're interested in building a community of people who are interested in Marxism and communist theory, then just get in touch with me and I'll send you a link. Otherwise, I guess we'll see you next week.
Yeah. We will see you next week.
Okay, bye.
Bye.